Tonight, you fall asleep in the modern world and wake in Europe in the year 1495, where the streets are narrow, the candles burn low, and somewhere beyond the dark, a new terror is just beginning to breathe. For now, though, nothing is chasing you. You are safe in a small room of timber and plaster, beneath a rough wool blanket, with moonlight resting on a wooden table, and the faint scent of smoke still clinging to the air. Outside, a cart rolls slowly over stone. Somewhere below, someone lifts a latch, murmurs a few tired words, and begins the quiet work of morning before dawn. It feels peaceful at first, and that is what makes this moment so strange, because beyond these walls lies a Europe full of color, ambition, trade, prayer, and restless human movement. A Europe on the verge of brilliance, and just as quietly, on the verge of fear. You have arrived before most people understand that anything is wrong. For a little while you stay still and let the room gather around you. The bed beneath you is narrow and slightly uneven, filled not with anything soft by modern standards, but with the sort of stuffing that rustles when you shift your weight. Straw, perhaps, dried grasses, something simple, practical, and close to the earth. The blanket is coarse, a little heavy, but warm enough. The air that touches your face is cool. It carries old smoke, a trace of dampness, and the faint mineral smell of stone that has held the night inside it for hours. No glowing numbers, no passing headlights, no sealed windows, no easy proof that you belong to the century you came from. Only darkness, wood grain, wool, and the strange calm of having nowhere else to be. A thin seam of moonlight slips through the shutter and lies across the room in pale silver. It catches the rim of a clay cup, the corner of a stool, the edge of a door made by hand and worn smooth in places by years of use. Nothing here is decorative for your sake. Nothing was arranged to be charming. And yet, the simplicity has its own kind of softness. This is not the polished past people imagine from gallery walls and costume dramas. It is smaller than that, colder, closer to breath and dust and tired hands. And somehow, because of that, it is easier to believe. You are not looking at history from a distance. You are inside it now. Somewhere beyond the room, the building settles with a light creak. Then comes silence again. Then, the small familiar proof of other lives waking nearby. A footstep overhead, a muffled cough, the sound of liquid being poured from one vessel into another, a bench dragged slightly across a floor. Each noise is ordinary. Each one steadies you. That is the first secret of entering another century. It does not begin with kings. It begins with wood smoke, with cold air at dawn, with a room that still holds the shape of sleep. Soon enough, you will step outside and find the larger world waiting. The roads, the churches, the merchants, the harbors, the markets already noisy with hunger and bargaining and news carried from elsewhere. But before any of that, there is this suspended moment, quiet enough for you. Europe in 1495 is not a dead world. It is not even a still one. It is crowded with motion. Ships cross familiar waters and unknown ones. Caravans pull goods inland from busy ports. Priests ring bells before sunrise. Apprentices sweep shop fronts. Bakers begin work in the dark. Noble families send letters. Servants haul water. Laborers shoulder loads. Scholars argue over old texts. Painters prepare pigments. And in narrow alleyways behind all the official grandeur of the age, life goes on in its usual human mixture of exhaustion, desire, devotion, and inconvenience. This is the Europe of late medieval stone and early Renaissance ambition. A Europe that smells, unmistakably, of animals, damp cloth, ashes, stale drink, lamp oil, wet earth, and too many human beings packed too closely together. A Europe where beauty and discomfort live side by side. A chapel painted like heaven may stand only minutes from a street slick with mud and kitchen waste. A merchant counting imported silk may pass a beggar asleep against a wall. A physician may speak solemnly of balance and health, while outside his window a city coughs, argues, hungers, buys, sins, prays, and keeps moving. It is easy from far away to imagine that history changes with a trumpet blast, that the sky darkens, that everyone senses the turn, that the people living through it know, in some clean and dramatic way, that they are standing at the beginning of something enormous. But that is almost never how it happens. Usually, history turns quietly. Usually, people wake in ordinary rooms. They stretch beneath rough blankets. They think about breakfast, or work, or debt. They open shutters. They cross courtyards. They complain about the cold. They wonder whether rain is coming. They think about a child with a fever, or a shipment delayed, or whether a customer will pay on time, or whether God has heard the prayer they muttered half asleep in the dark. And all the while, something larger is already moving toward them, not with speed, not with spectacle, but with patience. You can feel that patience here, if you listen for it. It is not in the room itself, which remains almost tender in its simplicity. It is not in the sounds below, where someone has begun the slow labor of kindling a morning fire. It is not even in the cool light gathering beyond the shutter, where dawn is beginning to dilute the blackness of the sky. It is somewhere farther out, in the streets you have not yet seen, in the conversations you have not yet overheard, in the bodies of strangers who do not yet know what they carry, in ports where sailors disembark laughing, in barracks where soldiers drink deeply after victory, in houses where no one has reason, yet, to be afraid. That is what makes this opening moment so delicate. You are early enough that the world still looks whole. And because the world still looks whole, you are allowed to notice the things that history often crushes flat when it tells its stories too quickly. The shape of the table, the grain of the door, the drag of wool over skin, the brief comfort of hearing another person move in the dark, the little pocket of safety inside a century that does not know what it is about to become. This matters, because what comes next in a story like this works best when it arrives softly, not as a shout, not as a blow, but as a change in the air. Outside, the cart you heard before has passed on. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then gives up. A draft threads its way through the shutter and touches the candle stub on the table. Though there is no flame there now, the room remains dim and almost kind. You could stay here longer if you wanted to, and perhaps some part of you does, but morning is getting closer. Soon, the city will begin to show itself, and when it does, you will see a world alive with energy, restless, clever, devout, hungry, creative, unwashed, unequal, and human in all the old familiar ways. You will see a continent on the edge of discovery and reinvention, a continent full of confidence, movement, and appetite. And just beneath all that life, something else. A disturbance so faint at first that it passes from rumor to rumor before it becomes history. For now, though, none of it has fully entered the room. The blanket is still warm. The moonlight is fading. The first hint of dawn rests behind the shutter. And you remain in that rarest of places, the quiet moment before the century reveals what it has been holding. By the time morning fully reaches you, the world outside has already begun to move. Not hurriedly, not yet, but with the layered, steady motion of a civilization that has been awake long before sunrise. Europe in these years does not rise all at once. It stirs in stages. First the ovens, then the bells, then the gates, then the voices. Then, slowly, the streets begin to fill with intention. You step out into that movement as if entering a river already in motion. The Renaissance, though no one standing here would call it that in quite the way later centuries will, is unfolding all around you. Not as a single shining event, but as 1,000 little acts of making, buying, arguing, copying, carving, praying, borrowing and building. It lives in the hands of painters grinding pigment in dim studios, in merchants untying knots from bales of cloth shipped across dangerous waters, in scribes bending over pages while the light is still good, in masons lifting stone, in apprentices learning to measure, gild, polish, carry, and keep quiet until spoken to. This is a world in motion, and much of that motion gathers in its cities. In the ports, morning comes with ropes, gulls, wet wood, and the slap of water against hulls. Ships stand at anchor like patient animals, their masts swaying lightly against a pale sky. Sailors climb rigging with a confidence that makes it look effortless. Porters bend beneath crates of dried fruit, wool, wine, oil, salted fish, alum, paper, leather, and spices that still feel to most people like the scent of another universe. Dockside officials count, inspect, argue, stamp, and wave things through with varying degrees of diligence depending on their honesty, their mood, and the size of the bribe concealed in the fold of a glove. Everywhere, there's the sound of things being transferred. Goods from ship to cart, coins from pouch to palm, news from traveler to innkeeper, rumor from one mouth to 10. You linger near the waterfront, long enough to feel the power, life of it settle into you. Tar, dart, salt, dotty, fish scales glinting on worn planks, men calling to one another across the quay. A boy no older than 12 struggling with a barrel, hoop twice the width of his chest. A woman kneeling beside baskets, rearranging eels and silver fish over beds of damp rushes so they look fresher than they are. Nearby, 2 merchants in good wool cloaks pretend to discuss shipment weights while actually measuring one another for weakness. Nothing here is still, but not all movement is noise. Beyond the port, the inns and taverns are coming into themselves. A door opens, and warm air spills briefly into the street, carrying the scent of broth, onions, stale ale, wood smoke, and damp clothing drying too slowly near a fire. Travelers sit hunched over rough tables, not all of them fully awake, each wearing the slightly distant expression of people who belong partly to the road and not entirely to the room. Teamsters eat quickly. Clerks unfold letters. A priest traveling under modest circumstances sips watered wine with the careful detachment of a man trying not to notice the conversation around him. In one corner, a mercenary sleeps face down on the table, one hand still loosely wrapped around an empty cup. At this hour, even the roughest places have a softness to them. Candles burned low in the night are replaced. Floors are swept badly but earnestly. A cook turns yesterday's scraps into something hot enough to call a meal. The ordinary machinery of survival continues without fanfare. It has to. Most people live too close to necessity to romanticize the day ahead. And yet, for all its hardship, this is not a world without beauty. Far from it. As the city brightens, color begins to emerge from the grayness of dawn. Dyed cloth hanging from an upper window, painted sign above a shop, the red cap of a clerk, the blue sleeve of a prosperous wife walking with a basket over her arm, saints in faded frescoes watching from chapel walls, the gold edge of a panel painting catching light through incense haze, fruit stacked in pyramids, polished brass, wet cobbles reflecting sky. The Renaissance lives there too, in appetite, display, and the growing confidence that the world can be studied, shaped, improved, adorned. In workshops, artists are already at work. You pass an open doorway and glimpse a room where daylight is being carefully managed, directed across boards and plaster and stretched cloth. A master studies a drawing with quiet severity, while an apprentice mixes color and another sands, a panel smooth enough to take a saint's face. The studio smells of oil, glue, chalk, dust, and something metallic beneath it all. Here, hands are training themselves to make flesh look more like flesh, drapery fall more like drapery. Buildings recede into believable distance. Heaven seem almost reachable, if one could just perfect the angle of light. Not far away, in another part of the city, There are goldsmiths at their benches, printers arranging type, notaries drafting contracts, mapmakers revising coastlines, scholars comparing old manuscripts against newly copied ones with the maddening precision of people who believe truth may hide in a better version of a sentence. The age is restless with skill, and trade feeds that restlessness. A city grows not only from stone and labor, but from exchange. A bolt of Florentine cloth appears on a northern back. Venetian glass turns up in a wealthy household far from the lagoon. Pepper from India passes through so many hands that by the time it reaches a kitchen table, it has become a story as much as a spice. Paper moves where once only parchment moved. Books, though still precious, begin to travel farther. Ideas travel with them, sometimes disguised as accounts, diagrams, letters, sermons, inventories, or medical notes copied in the margins of something more respectable. Even the churches, ancient as they seem, are caught in the same current. Step inside one, and the air changes immediately. Cooler, dimmer, thick with wax and stone, and the faint sweetness of incense, trapped in cloth and mortar. A woman kneels near the entrance, with her head bowed, lips moving too softly to hear. Somewhere farther in, a sacristan adjusts linens at the altar. Light drops through high windows in dusty shafts, illuminating suspended particles that drift like slow, private weather. Churches gather every kind of person. Nobles seeking favor, widows seeking comfort, merchants seeking legitimacy, beggars seeking shelter, mothers seeking miracles, priests seeking order, boys seeking distraction. The building receives them all, and with them come the age's fears and ambitions, its griefs and bargains, its vows, donations, calculations, and acts of sincere devotion. Outside again, the streets continue to thicken. A file of soldiers passes at an intersection, not in perfect formation, but with the loose confidence of men accustomed to carrying danger with them. Their boots are dusty, their cloaks weathered. One has a bandaged wrist, another a scar that disappears into his beard. They draw looks as they pass, some admiring, some wary, some openly resentful. Armies bring money, appetite, and protection, but they also bring debt, noise, disruption, and the ever-present possibility that what is peaceful now may not remain so for long. Still, the city absorbs them as it absorbs everyone else. A fruit seller calls out prices. A mule resists a turn. Two children chase each other too fast through a lane and are shouted back by an old woman leaning from an upstairs window. Laundry stirs overhead. A knife is sharpened on a wheel. A bell rings again. A cart gets stuck. Someone laughs. Someone spits. Someone prays. Someone swears. Someone falls briefly in love with a face glimpsed through a passing crowd and will never see it again. This is what makes the world feel so complete at first. It is not merely grand. It is inhabited. And because it is so inhabited, so crowded with ordinary labor, and ordinary vanity, and ordinary beauty, it becomes easy to believe that the day will continue in the same shape it began. That the ships will keep arriving. That merchants will keep haggling. That workshops will keep humming. That priests will keep blessing. That soldiers will keep marching through, and then away. That whatever has troubled one city will remain there. That life, if not easy, is at least legible. There is comfort in that illusion. You feel it now as you move through a market square where baskets overflow with beans, onions, figs, nuts, and herbs tied in fragrant bundles. Where a butcher wipes his hands on a stained apron and negotiates with a woman who has no intention of paying what he asks. Where a pair of students in worn dark robes argue over Aristotle, as if philosophy might exempt them from rent. Where a courier pushes through the crowd with a sealed packet, and the importance of a man carrying more than paper. Where all the structures of the age, faith, hunger, class, ambition, desire, art, commerce stand close enough to brush sleeves. It is a vivid world, and that vividness matters, because a world this bright does not simply darken, It tilts. A world this animated does not freeze all at once. It continues to move while something unseen begins to travel through it. And a world this confident, this full of appetite and invention and traffic between bodies and cities and shores, will remember the coming disturbance more sharply for having seemed, only a moment earlier, so alive. But that thought remains only a shadow at the edge of the day. For now, everything is still passing as ordinary. The bells are still bells. The ships are still ships. The inns are still full of travelers shaking out road dust and asking for food. The churches still gather the faithful. The artists still work toward beauty. The merchants still believe that enough calculation can master risk. The streets still carry the same human mixture of energy and fatigue they carried yesterday. And that is exactly why what comes next will feel so unsettling. Because in Naples, among victory, celebration, trade, noise, and the easy confidence of a city used to receiving strangers the ordinary face of life, will make the first shift harder to see, and far harder to forget. Naples, February 1495. The French have taken the city, and the celebration has not yet exhausted itself. Victory lingers here not as a single event, but as an atmosphere thick, noisy, wine-warm, and slightly unsteady. It hangs in the air of courtyards and taverns, slips through open doorways, rolls down toward the harbor with laughter too loud for the hour, and rises again in the smoke of cook fires, in shouted songs, in boots striking stone after midnight. Even in the morning, when daylight ought to restore order, the city still feels as though it has gone to bed late and woken with its pulse a little too fast. This is where you first truly arrive. Not in Europe as an idea, not in the Renaissance as a beautiful abstraction, but in one particular city with one particular mood, sunlit, crowded, slightly dazzled, and not nearly as stable as it wants to appear. Naples is a port city, which means it knows strangers already. It knows the language of incoming ships, unloaded goods, exchanged coin, and temporary loyalties. It knows the smell of brine and tar, fish guts and citrus peel, damp rope, olive oil, sweat, and smoke. It knows merchants from far away, priests with business in other dioceses, sailors who vanish and return, and armed men whose arrival is often less a surprise than a recurring condition of life. But there is a difference between strangers passing through and an occupying army celebrating inside your walls. The French king's forces have not come alone. They never do. Victory travels with its own human weather soldiers, camp followers, servants, mule drivers, armorers, cooks, laundresses, gamblers, prostitutes, scribes, surgeons, petty thieves, and opportunists. Every size. And Naples, for the moment, is holding them all. You walk through streets that seem almost too narrow for everything they are being asked to contain. Men in worn military cloaks lean against walls with cups in hand, laughing in several languages. Not all of them are French. There are Swiss pikemen broad in the shoulder and impatient at being kept idle. German mercenaries who carry themselves with the blunt calm of men used to harsh contracts and harsher marches. Italians serving where profit or allegiance has placed them. Spaniards, too, and others harder to place at a glance, drawn into the orbit of campaign and pay. Armies in this age are rarely of one nation in any clean sense. They are assembled things, temporary worlds held together by money, command, appetite, and the promise of spoils. Now that the fighting has paused, appetite is winning. Casks are opened, meat is roasted, dice are thrown, songs are sung badly, and then sung again. A victory feast, if stretched long enough, becomes simply the new texture of daily life. Men who were cold, hungry, and disciplined during the campaign begin to behave like men, suddenly released from consequence. In the harbor quarter, taverns swell early. You see doors flung open to the street, bench legs uneven on stone floors, pitchers lifted and emptied, elbows colliding, serving girls weaving between tables with practiced indifference to wandering hands. One corner hosts a half-serious argument over pay. Another, a game of chance already turning sour. Near the door, a man with a torn sleeve and a fresh scar is trying to impress two companions with the same embellished story for the third time. No one minds. Everyone is living slightly above himself in the afterglow of occupation. The city's own people move through this atmosphere with a complicated skill. Some profit from it. Others endure it. Most do both, depending on the hour. A baker sells bread to men she would rather never see again. A wine merchant waters his stock and doubles his prices. A woman standing in a shaded doorway reads the mood of passing soldiers with the sharpness of someone for whom survival depends on judging desire before it speaks. Porters keep working because goods do not unload themselves. Boatmen ferry passengers because harbors do not pause for politics. Children watch everything. Old men complain. Shopkeepers lower their voices when uniforms pass and raise them again once they are gone. What strikes you first is not terror. It is looseness. The particular looseness that enters a city just after force has done its work, but before the new order has settled into any stable shape. Rules exist, of course, but they seem thinner than usual, stretched over appetite and fatigue and private calculation. Doors stay open later. Tempers lift faster. Bargains are made quickly. Promises are spoken lightly. The city is not collapsing. It is simply living in that dangerous interval when authority has changed hands, but ordinary habit has not yet learned the new boundaries. And because this is Naples, beauty continues despite all of it. Laundry lifts in strips of white and faded color between upper windows. Church domes catch the afternoon sun. Fruit still shines in market stalls. Sea light flashes suddenly at the end of a lane. A girl carrying a basket of lemons walks past three armed men without lowering her pace. Bells continue to ring the hours, whether armies listen or not. You begin to understand why this city feels so vivid. Everything is close together here. Trade and hunger, piety and lust, music and shouting, silk and dirt, celebration and unease. Even the women moving through these streets carry the double awareness of a city that has seen power arrive and pass before. Some are wives or daughters on errands, heads covered, steps measured. Others are servants moving quickly between houses. Others still stand openly in places where men have learned to look for company. They are watched, bargained with, flattered, insulted, desired, blamed, and needed in ways that change from hour to hour. In the occupied city, they become part of the invisible economy of aftermath comfort, survival, transaction, and risk all bound together. The soldiers, flushed with victory, behave as though the city has opened itself for their pleasure. But Naples herself seems less convinced. You sense it in the faces of locals who step aside without bowing, in the quick glance exchanged between a fish seller and a passing priest, in the way a woman at a fountain stops speaking the moment two foreign men approach, in the small signals by which occupied people preserve a private world beneath the visible one. They know the celebrations will not last forever. They know armies always move on. They know cities remember what marching men preferred to forget. At the harbor, the whole scene widens. Ships rock gently at anchor while longshoremen continue their labor beneath gulls and shouted instructions. Some vessels have come for war, some for trade, many for both. Nets are mended beside stacked barrels. Horses are led nervously off gangplanks. Sailors carry stories from one shore to another with the same ease as they carry fleas, spices, song, and lies. The water slaps stone in a rhythm older than the conquest itself, indifferent to whichever king now claims the city. You stop for a moment near the quay and simply watch. A man rolling a cask uphill with his shoulder braced against the wood. A servant girl emptying cloudy water into the gutter. A cluster of mercenaries bargaining over a pair of boots. A priest trying to keep his hem out of the mud. A woman laughing too brightly at something a soldier says. A pair of boys fighting with sticks until a real soldier passes and they suddenly fall silent. A dog weaving expertly between legs in search of scraps. This is the first fixed stage of your journey. and it feels almost reassuring in its completeness. You know where you are. You know what sort of city this is. You know the smell of it, the sound of it, the way light lands on its walls in late afternoon. You know that power is present here, but so is commerce, and appetite, and local knowledge, and the long resilience of people who have lived too near history for too long to be astonished by every new ruler. In that sense, Naples does not appear to be standing at the beginning of anything. It appears to be doing what cities always do after war: absorbing, profiting, adjusting, waiting. And yet that is the strange truth of this moment. No one in these streets, not the drunk soldier, not the cautious innkeeper, not the woman counting coins with one thumb, not the surgeon cleaning his instruments in a back room, not the priest, not the porter, not the child watching everything from a doorstep understands that they are standing at the threshold of a disaster that will travel far beyond this harbor. That they are standing at the threshold of long out. From where you stand, it hardly looks like the opening of a continental epidemic. It looks instead like a city after conquest, a little louder than usual, a little less careful, a little too full of men with money in their purses and heat in their blood. From a distance, history would flatten this place into a sentence: Naples, after the French capture. But up close, it feels softer and messier than that. Not a headline, not a turning point. Just a place where wine is poured, business continues, church bells ring, uniforms crowd the alleys, and life somehow stubbornly goes on in its ordinary ways. That is what makes it such a dangerous beginning, because what comes next will not arrive with a trumpet or a proclamation. It will begin with things small enough to dismiss: a sore, a pain, a rumor, a sleepless night. And when the first signs appear, they will seem so minor, so easy to look past, that almost everyone will do exactly that. The whispers begin so softly that, at first, they barely seem worth keeping. They move through Naples the way many things move through a port city without ceremony. Passed from table to table, from quay to alley, from one half-trusted mouth to another. In an inn near the harbor, someone lowers his voice over wine. At a bathhouse, two men stop speaking when a third enters. In the market, a woman pauses between weighing onions and repeats something she heard from her cousin's husband, who heard it from a soldier's groom, who heard it from a surgeon attached to the French camp. No one tells the story quite the same way. That is part of what makes it linger. A strange sore, someone says. A fever that follows, says another. No, not a fever exactly, more like a sickness in the blood. No, not the blood. The bones. The bones, especially at night. You begin to notice how often the same few fragments return, even when the details change. A wound that does not trouble a man much at first. A mark in a hidden place. Then, sometime later, pain that seems to move deeper into the body, as though it has learned the way in. Restless nights, a rash, a weakness no amount of sleep seems to soften. Men who had been loud in taverns growing quiet for reasons they cannot easily explain. Still, Naples does not stop for whispers. The harbor remains busy. Bargains continue. Soldiers drink, laugh, boast, and spend. Priests say mass. Shopkeepers sell. Boats come in and go out. If anything, the very fullness of life gives rumor more places to hide. A city this crowded can carry unease for days before it admits to fear. You hear more in the inns than anywhere else. Inns collect not just travelers, but unfinished versions of reality. A merchant arrives with news from Rome that is already outdated by the time he sets down his cup. A sailor swears to something he saw in Barcelona, only for another to insist it happened first in Sicily. A mercenary who has marched through 3 territories in 6 months tells the same story in 3 different tones depending on how much wine he has had and who is listening. And somewhere inside all this smoke and exaggeration, a pattern is forming. One evening, in a room made yellow, by candlelight, and loud with men trying to outtalk one another. You hear the first account that feels less like gossip and more like warning. It comes from a sailor with weathered skin and the flattened calm of someone who has spent too much of his life at sea to be impressed by ordinary danger. He is not speaking to the whole room, only to the few around his table, but in places like this, privacy is only another kind of invitation. He says that among returning men, some soldiers, some seamen, some camp followers, there have been cases of a troubling kind. It begins, he claims, with a lesion so slight a man might laugh at it or hide it or ignore it altogether. Then after a time, the body changes its mood. The skin breaks strangely. The limbs ache. The nights become long and punishing. Some men complain that their bones feel as if they are being gnawed from the inside, especially once darkness settles and the body has nothing to distract. He says this last part quietly. The bones at night. That detail seems to disturb the men around him more than the rest. Perhaps because it is intimate. Perhaps because it feels harder to dismiss. A cut can be explained. A fever can be explained. Even a rash can be explained, if one is determined enough. But pain that deepens in the dark, in the hidden inner scaffolding of the body, that seems to belong to a different category of trouble. You notice the room in a new way after that. Not dramatically. No one leaps to his feet. No one announces catastrophe. A joke is made. Someone shrugs. Another man says sailors are always sick with something. Cups are refilled. Dice strike wood. Yet an invisible thread has been pulled through the evening. Men who were casually sprawled now seem slightly more aware of their own bodies. One scratches absently at his wrist. Another presses a hand into his lower back as if remembering an ache he meant not to think about. That is how unease first enters a place like this. Not as terror, as attention. By day, the city still looks much the same, but now you begin to see it with a different eye. When a soldier moves stiffly as he steps down from a curb, you wonder whether he is merely tired from campaign, or carrying the beginning of something else. When a woman in the street turns away from a familiar customer, you wonder whether she has heard enough to start choosing caution over coin. When you pass a surgeon's doorway and smell vinegar, herbs, and old blood, you wonder what sorts of complaints are being brought in after dark. The complaints themselves are still hard to pin down. Some involve sores in private places, which makes men reluctant to speak plainly of them. Others seem to involve eruptions on the skin, or headaches, or fevered exhaustion. Some pass quickly enough to encourage denial. Others vanish and return. That, perhaps, is what makes the thing so unsettling in its earliest shape. It does not present itself cleanly. It does not behave with the courtesy of a known illness. It hints, withdraws, and changes its face. And because it changes its face, people begin offering it stories. Stories are always quicker than understanding. At the harbor you hear one of the most persistent versions taking shape. It begins, as so many stories in these years do, with voyages westward, with islands, with strange peoples, with men returning from waters that most of Europe only recently learned to imagine. Columbus's name now drifts through conversation with the charged curiosity attached to anyone who has sailed into the unknown and lived to be spoken of afterward. Some say the sickness came back with those voyages, not from Naples, not from France, not from any Christian kingdom at all, but from across the ocean. Carried home in blood and flesh and contact, no one will admit to too openly. The theory suits certain minds immediately. It has distance in it, mystery, a satisfying geography of blame. It places the source far away, on the edge of new maps, among people most listeners will never meet and can therefore imagine any way they choose. But even here, the story is unstable. Others insist the affliction must have existed before. They say old diseases sometimes change their character, that camps, brothels, ships, hunger, and war merely ripen what was already among men. A barber mutters that every generation believes its plagues are new because memory is weak and vanity is strong. A priest claims that whatever the root of arrival, moral corruption has prepared the ground. A merchant, less interested in sin than in patterns, observes simply that traffic has increased everywhere. More soldiers, more ships, more strangers, more ports linked to more ports, and that what moves with men now moves farther than it once did. All of them are trying to make the shape of something before they truly know its outline. Meanwhile, the afflicted remain half seen. You do not yet witness great numbers of broken bodies in the streets. This is not that kind of beginning. The first cases remain hidden in rooms, in private pain, in men reluctant to confess, in women who cannot afford to stop working, in physicians still uncertain whether they are confronting one illness or several. Shame does part of the work. So does confusion. So does hope, that stubborn early hope that any new symptom may yet turn out to be ordinary. In that uncertainty, the city continues to function. Morning bread is baked, fish are gutted, children run errands, church doors open, armor is repaired, letters are delivered, laundry drips from windows. The sea keeps touching the harbor in the same patient rhythm as before, and yet beneath all this ordinary movement, an unnamed question has begun to circulate. What is this thing? Not loudly, not scientifically, not yet with any coherent urgency, but enough to alter the air. In a world without firm diagnosis, a disease begins as a mood as much as a condition. It gathers first in the imagination, in glances, in hesitation, in the way a story is repeated with one added detail each time, in the way people begin to listen differently when they hear of a sore, a rash, a sleepless night, a pain that lives deep in the bones. Much later, the illness will acquire a name that history recognizes. Much later, physicians and writers will classify it, describe it, argue over its origin, attempt to locate it in systems of cause and remedy, and attach to it all the moral, medical, and political language that fearful societies build around disease. But here, in Naples, at the edge of its first European notoriety, it has no settled name at all. It is only a horror without a proper shape, a thing spoken of in fragments, a thing noticed too late, a thing still soft enough in outline to be covered over by rumor, shame, fantasy, theology, and blame. And because it remains unnamed, it becomes easier for everyone to imagine it different. For some, it is foreign. For others, sinful. For others, merely another camp sickness that will burn itself out once the soldiers move on. For others still, it is something too embarrassing to describe and too frightening to inspect. The lack of certainty does not calm anyone. It feeds the imagination. You feel that now in the city's shifting undercurrent. Not panic still, not panic, but a slight tightening. A new hesitation in places built on easy contact. A sharper curiosity when a man disappears from his usual haunts. A growing attention to bodies. Who looks tired? Who scratches at the skin? Who walks stiffly? Who drinks harder than before? Who keeps one hand always near the lower back, as though guarding a secret ache? Naples has not changed its face, but it has begun, just barely, to change its gaze. And soon that gaze will not remain here. But armies do not stay still forever. Campaigns turn, orders change, pay runs short, alliances shift. The men now drinking in occupied streets will eventually shoulder their gear, gather their horses, curse the road, and leave the city behind. When they do, the unease that first found language in Naples will leave with them. And whatever this thing is, it will begin its journey through Europe in their company. Cities can hold a great deal for a time. Noise, victory, rumor, desire, even disease, briefly. But armies do not remain in celebration forever, and neither does history. The mood in Naples begins to shift, almost as quietly as the sickness first did. What had seemed at first like a city suspended in the afterglow of conquest starts to feel more temporary, more brittle, more contingent on decisions being made elsewhere, by men who do not sleep under these roofs or smell this harbor air. News moves through the streets in uneven waves, first as speculation, then as argument, then as fact hard enough to change behavior. The French position is no longer secure. An alliance of Italian powers is gathering against them, and the easy confidence of occupation begins to thin. Officers spend more time in conversation and less in open celebration. Messengers come and go with an urgency that cannot be mistaken for ceremony. Men who had been drinking freely now inspect straps, sort gear, count what remains of their pay, and ask how soon they may be ordered to move. The city, which had adjusted itself to the presence of victory, now starts adjusting again to the possibility of departure. That change matters, because what Naples has been holding, its excess, its strangers, its intimacies, its hidden sores, its whispered suspicions, will not vanish when the army leaves. It will travel. When the retreat begins, it does not look like the clean reversal of a triumphal entrance. Retreats rarely do. They are made of fatigue, improvisation, wounded pride, hurried packing, uneasy horses, half-broken wagons, and men who would prefer not to think too closely about what they are carrying inside their own bodies. Units break apart and reform. Mercenaries peel away toward old employers, new contracts, or simply the nearest road that leads somewhere safer. Camp followers attach themselves to whoever still has coin. Servants vanish and reappear. Those well enough to march. Those too sick to keep pace are left behind, hidden, dragged along, or absorbed into the anonymous human debris that always follows war. And as the army disperses northward, outward, back toward France, and across the many fault lines of Europe, something else disperses with it. Not as a cloud, not as a visible curse, not even at first as a recognized epidemic. It travels in flesh, in a soldier who thinks the sore has healed, and therefore no longer matters. In a camp woman who moves on to another garrison town. In a sailor who returns to a ship and then another port. In a groom who shares a bed in an inn along the road. In a young man who survives battle only to be undone later by a pain he cannot explain. In a body that appears, for a little while, to recover, and therefore carries the illusion of safety farther than truth should allow. This is how the fear begins to leave Naples. Not all at once, not under a single banner, but in dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of small human departures. The roads take it first. You can feel the map widening now. The story loosens its grip on one city and begins to follow movement itself. Dusty military roads, river crossings, alpine routes, merchant paths that have served generations of trade, and now, without meaning to, the same arteries that carry silver, letters, wine, silk, wool, and news are carrying pain into places that have not yet learned to expect it. At each stop, the illness arrives half hidden. A man reaches an inn with a fever and calls it exhaustion. Another asks a barber surgeon about a troubling lesion and is given a salve, a shrug, or a prayer depending on the skill and confidence of the practitioner. A woman in a town far from Naples notices that a customer who seemed healthy weeks ago now winces when he sits, or scratches absently at a rash, or drinks with the desperate concentration of someone trying to numb a body that no longer feels trustworthy. No proclamation announces the spread, but the pattern repeats often enough that people begin to attach stories to it. And once people attach stories to illness, they almost immediately attach blame. That part moves astonishingly fast. In Italy, many call it the French disease. The name feels logical to those who watch the occupying army arrive, celebrate, sicken, and scatter. Why not place the affliction on the very men whose presence marked its first explosive notoriety? The label carries anger with it, and perhaps a small satisfaction too. If the enemy brought not only war but corruption of the flesh, then history has supplied a fitting moral stain to match military trespass. But as the sickness crosses borders, names begin to shift. In France, of course, it cannot remain French. There, the blame is redirected outward. It becomes the Neapolitan disease, or else some variation that places the source beyond the kingdom's own skin. Elsewhere, it may become the Spanish sickness, the Italian sickness, the disease of this people, or that people, this army, or that port, this borderland, or that disgraced city. The labels multiply because blame prefers geography. It is easier to bear what frightens you if you can point to a direction and say, "It came from there." You begin to hear how instinctive this becomes. A merchant swears the corruption must have risen from Naples itself, from the filth and looseness of a city overrun by camp life. A Frenchman insists it is a southern rot, unfairly pinned to his countrymen. A priest in one town mutters that foreign soldiers always bring more than war. A physician, trying to sound rational, proposes that unfamiliar climates and immoral habits have combined to produce some new and dangerous imbalance. A sailor laughs and says all lands blame the next shore when they are too ashamed to inspect their own. He is closer to the truth than he knows. Because what is spreading through Europe is not merely an illness. It is also a reflex. A reflex to make suffering feel more orderly by giving it an enemy. A reflex to call the unknown foreign, even when it is already in your own bed, your own parish, your own regiment, your own household. A reflex to translate fear into accusation before understanding has had time to arrive. And this reflex proves almost as contagious as the disease itself. You can trace it from city to city. Every place rewords the same impulse in its own accent. Every population turns slightly away from itself and toward another people, another army, another shore. The names change, but the emotional logic remains identical. We did not make this. They brought it. We were living as we always have. The corruption came from elsewhere. How familiar that sounds. How human. Meanwhile, the suffering itself pays no attention to names. Whatever people choose to call the disease, it continues in the same intimate and merciless grammar. A first lesion, a false lull, then rashes, pain, fever, weakness, sleeplessness, humiliations of the skin, and the growing dread that what entered the body quietly may not leave it at all. In one town it is called French, and in another Neapolitan, but the man lying with his bones aching in the dark would struggle to distinguish the two. This sameness becomes one of the saddest truths of the spread. Borders alter language. They do not alter pain. You notice, too, that the disease seems to expose something already present in Europe's life. The continent is more connected now than many people fully grasp. Armies move farther. Trade reaches wider. Ports are busier. Letters travel faster. Students cross territories to study. Pilgrims, merchants, clergy, envoys, craftsmen, sailors, prostitutes, laborers, and adventurers pass continually from one city into another. The Renaissance has not only awakened art and scholarship, it has intensified circulation, and circulation is rarely selective. What carries books also carries rumor. What carries spices also carries infection. What carries soldiers home also carries whatever the campaign has written into their bodies. The roads of Europe are no longer merely roads between places. They are channels through which one city's crisis becomes another city's uneasy whisper. That widening is what gives the story its new shape. Up to now, Naples has been a stage. Now Europe becomes the stage. The camera of attention, if one can imagine it that way, begins pulling back. A city becomes a network. A rumor becomes a pattern. A handful of suspicious cases becomes a continental murmur. The old confidence that trouble belongs to one place starts to fail. Not everywhere at once, not cleanly, but enough that people begin to recognize something more unsettling than a local outbreak. A moving disturbance, attached not to a neighborhood, but to mobility itself. And still, in every place, daily life continues beside it. Bread is baked in towns already seeded with the illness. Ships unload in ports where a few quiet cases have begun to trouble the surgeons. Mass is said, markets held, taxes collected, apprentices scolded, marriages negotiated, contracts signed, harvests tallied. Europe does not pause simply because a new disease is learning its roots. If anything, the ordinariness of daily life becomes the very surface along which the danger glides. That is part of why it feels so miasmic, so difficult to hold in the mind. Nothing looks apocalyptic. A rider arrives. Customer coughs. A wife worries. A priest hears confession. A soldier limps. A merchant pays for a room and leaves before dawn. A barber lays out his instruments in a town where, 6 months earlier, no one had ever heard this particular cluster of complaints. History will later draw lines on maps and speak of waves, outbreaks, origins, vectors. But from within the moment, it feels more like dampness spreading through cloth, subtle at first, then unmistakable, then impossible to say exactly where one stain ended and the next began. And so the fear travels on, not always openly, but persistently, with the men retreating from Naples, with those who welcomed them elsewhere, with those who never saw the city at all, and yet will come to know its aftermath in the private language of the body. The routes of war become the routes of rumor. The roots of rumor become the roots of diagnosis, blame, prayer, and uneasy adaptation. And in that spread lies the deeper revelation of this chapter. Not only has a disease begun to move through Europe, a human instinct has moved with it, the instinct to explain suffering by naming someone else as its source. The labels will go on changing from region to region. The sermons will vary. The theories will multiply. The accusations will turn with the map. But the experience beneath them remains stubbornly alike. Pain is still pain. Shame is still shame. Fear still seeks a face. And the body, once entered by this strange new affliction, suffers in remarkably similar ways, whether the sufferer speaks Italian, French, German, or any other tongue. The name changes at the border. The night pain does not. The suspicion does not. The silence around intimate symptoms does not. As the roads carry soldiers and sickness farther from Naples, other cities begin to inherit not only cases, but questions. Questions physicians cannot yet answer, priests cannot fully contain, and ordinary people cannot stop asking once the pattern becomes too visible to deny. And in Rome, and later in Florence, those questions begin to deepen, because there, among courts and churches and learned men still trying to fit the new affliction into old ways of thinking, Europe will start to do something more than blame. It will begin, slowly and imperfectly, to ask what exactly is passing through the body and through the soul of the age. By the time you reach Rome, the mood has changed, not into panic. Rome is too layered, too ceremonial, too practiced in absorbing bad news for that. But anxiety has entered the city and settled there in a distinctly Roman way, half in whispers, half in pronouncements, half in private dread, and half in public moral certainty. The bells still ring, processions still move, cardinals still receive visitors behind heavy doors, priests still lift the host, scribes still sharpen quills and fold letters with exacting care. Yet beneath the order, beneath the rhythm of liturgy and routine, something unsettled is working its way through the city's consciousness. In Rome, illness is never only physical. It is read, interpreted, placed into a moral frame, turned toward heaven as a question, and often returned from heaven as a warning. So when this new affliction begins appearing with enough frequency to resist dismissal, the Church does what institutions of certainty often do when confronted by confusion. It speaks first in the language it already knows. Sermons sharpen. References to sin grow more pointed. The body becomes a text, and this disease appearing, as it so often does in places of intimacy and secrecy, is treated by many as though it were not merely a suffering, but a revelation of hidden vice. You hear it in churches where preachers speak of corruption moving beneath the skin, the way transgression moves beneath respectable appearances. You hear it in courtyards where noble households discuss outbreaks with lowered voices, always managing to imply that whatever touches their own circle must somehow be more tragic, more mysterious, less blameworthy than what happens among soldiers or prostitutes. You hear it in confessionals, in kitchens, in the uneasy pauses that follow certain kinds of rumor. Rome has a genius for symbolism, and this illness arrives at a moment when symbolism is easier to produce than explanation. The city itself seems to encourage that mood. Ancient ruins stare across streets where new power is always being staged. Marble fragments of the old world lie near shrines of the new one. Men discuss Aristotle and St. Augustine in the same breath, and no one finds this strange. If a disease cannot yet be grasped through anatomy or cause, then it will be grasped through allegory, through scripture, through the conviction that what strikes the flesh must also mean something about the soul. And yet the body remains stubbornly resistant to metaphor. Because when you step away from the sermon and into the physician's chamber, the reality becomes less elegant. There, the old medical system is trying its best to absorb a thing it does not know how to name properly. Learned men still think through humors, through balances and imbalances of hot and cold, wet and dry, blood and bile and phlegm. The intellectual scaffolding is ancient, revered, intricate, and still very much alive. It has explained countless ailments, or at least provided a language for treating them. But now this new disease arrives like a visitor who refuses to sit where tradition tells him to sit. You begin to see how strained that old language becomes. A physician examines a patient and tries to classify the symptoms by temperament, by excess heat, by corruption of the blood, by dampness or dryness, by celestial influence, by diet, by season, by moral behavior, by whatever framework remains available. Bloodletting is prescribed in some cases, because bloodletting has long been prescribed when something seems excessive, inflamed, disordered. Purging may follow. Sweating too. Anything that might rebalance the body, force out corruption, restore harmony. The confidence with which these remedies are proposed is often inversely related to the confidence with which they succeed. You hear discussions of mercury rubbed into the skin, inhaled as vapor, administered with the grim hope that what is harsh enough to torment the patient may also torment the disease. In certain rooms, the smell of it lingers faintly beneath herbs and vinegar. Some practitioners swear by it because they have little else. Others distrust it because they have already seen what it can do. Mouths flooded with saliva, gums inflamed, teeth loosened, hands trembling, patients left thinner, weaker, stranger in themselves than before treatment began. And still it is used, not because it is safe, not because it is understood, but because medicine in an age like this cannot simply wait with folded hands. It must do something, even if the something is brutal. Alongside mercury comes another hope, guaiacum, imported at great expense, wrapped in the seductive aura of distant lands and natural cure. A wood from across the ocean, boiled into decoctions, praised by some as if Providence had hidden a remedy near the place where the affliction first emerged. That logic carries a kind of beauty, even when the evidence remains uncertain. The world has recently widened. Perhaps its cures have widened too. Patients drink bitter preparations, sweat under blankets, endure elaborate regimens. For the wealthy, these become private trials conducted behind carved doors and curtained beds. For the poor, such remedies remain expensive rumors. In Rome, then, two kinds of interpretation. One asks what sin this reveals. The other asks what imbalance this produces. Neither asks, not yet in any clear and modern way, what this thing is in itself. That question waits for another kind of gaze. And it is in Florence that you begin to feel that gaze taking shape. Florence does not lack religion, or vanity, or moral alarm. Far from it. But Florence is also a city of close looking. Painters study drapery, musculature, shadow. Goldsmiths study reflection. Architects study proportion. Bankers study risk. Humanists study old texts with the impatience of men who suspect the copy is corrupt and the original still worth recovering. It is a city where observation already has prestige, even when theory still outranks it. By the time you arrive, that sensibility has begun to touch medicine as well. The city wears its brilliance with a more troubled expression now. You sense it in the studios and streets alike. Beauty remains everywhere on facades, in chapels, in garments dyed with care, in the measured geometry of courtyards, but some undercurrent has darkened the mood. Preachers warn more fiercely. Households speak more cautiously. The confidence of the age has not collapsed, but it has been forced to accommodate a note of unease. Even the art seems to feel it. You notice fewer easy gestures of abundance in certain workshops, fewer airy conversations untouched by the age's anxieties. It is not that painting ceases to be beautiful. Rather, beauty has become more alert to suffering. The spiritual and the bodily, once so often separated into neat visual hierarchies, now seem to press more closely against each other. Flesh is not merely idealized, it is vulnerable, mortal, markable, and in the physician's workroom where you spend time observing, that vulnerability is impossible to ignore. Here, the approach is quieter than in Rome, less eager to moralize, though not free of the age's assumptions. Instruments are arranged with care, notes are kept, patients are asked not only how they feel, but when a symptom began, where it appeared first, whether it vanished and returned, what followed what. It is this attention to sequence that begins to matter, because this disease, unlike many others, seems to unfold in stages. At first, a sore often small, often hidden, often painless enough to be dismissed. Then an interval in which the body appears to recover, encouraging fatal optimism. Then later, a rash, a fever, exhaustion, aches, pains that move inward, symptoms that no longer seem local but systemic, as though the body itself has become the territory of the disease, rather than merely its point of entry. This pattern fascinates and troubles the more observant physicians. It does not align neatly with inherited expectations. It refuses to behave like the diseases described in the old authorities, or at least refuses to do so without distortion. The books remain on the shelves: Hippocrates, Galen, commentaries upon commentaries, but increasingly, men confronting actual patients find themselves glancing from parchment back to skin, from doctrine back to lived progression, and noticing the mismatch. That mismatch is more important than it first appears, because once a disease fails to fit the books lose some of their sovereignty. Not all at once, of course. No one in Florence suddenly abandons tradition and invents modern medicine by force of frustration. But something subtle begins. Physicians, artists, natural philosophers, and educated observers start trusting the eye just a little more. The sequence of symptoms matters. The details of a case matter. What the patient says happened first matters. The body becomes not merely an example of theory, but a source of evidence. And that is the quiet revelation concealed inside this period of helplessness. The new disease is terrible. It humiliates, disables, isolates, and confounds. Yet because it does not sit obediently inside inherited categories, it pushes certain minds into a more empirical posture. They do not yet have the tools to solve it. They barely have the language to describe what they are doing differently. But they are already beginning to look before they explain. A sore is noted. A rash is compared. A treatment is observed to worsen rather than heal. A period of remission is recorded. A later return of deeper suffering is recognized. These are small acts, but history often changes through accumulations of small acts carried out by people who do not know they are early. When you walk back through Florence in the evening, the city helps the thought settle. Bells soften over rooftops. Window light appears one square at a time. Somewhere a lutenist is practicing badly, repeating the same phrase until it almost becomes soothing. Women draw water from a courtyard well. A boy runs an errand with too much speed and is scolded from above. At a street corner, two men argue over politics, then drift into talk of physicians, and from there into whether God has sent the disease or merely allowed it. No one knows, not truly, and it is precisely that not knowing which is beginning to alter the structure of thought. Out of impotence comes attention. Out of repeated failure comes comparison. Out of the old system's inability to fully contain the illness comes the first dim outline of a new way of reading the body. Not a revolution yet, only a turn. A turn so quiet that most of the city would never think to name it. For ordinary people, the disease is still many things before it is a medical problem. It is shame. It is rumor. It is suspicion between lovers, fear in marriage beds, caution in brothels, silence in respectable households, a sermon for the devout, a scandal for the curious, a sentence whispered about someone who has stopped appearing in public. But for a smaller number of watchers, those who draw, dissect, compare, record is becoming something else as well. A challenge issued directly to old certainty. And from that challenge, a different medicine may someday emerge. For now, though, the city remains suspended between worlds. One still speaks in humors and divine warnings. The other has begun, hesitantly, to trust observed reality when tradition falls short. Neither is fully formed. Both coexist in the same street, the same household, the same mind. The result is not clarity. It is stillness of another kind. A reflective stillness. A city pausing over what it cannot master. Culture beginning, very slightly, to look inward with new seriousness because its old answers are no longer enough. And as that seriousness gathers in Rome and Florence, another city farther north will attempt something different again. Not interpretation, not theory, not even, at first, understanding, but control. Because in Venice, Europe will begin to experiment with another response to the unknown. If it cannot yet explain the disease, perhaps it can regulate the world around it. Venice appears first as an arrangement of intelligence, not warmth, not innocence, not even beauty, though beauty is everywhere if you know how to look at water and stone and changing light. What strikes you first is intelligence, the kind built over centuries by a city that has learned to survive by watching movement, measuring risk, and turning uncertainty into procedure. Venice is a republic of merchants, clerks, sailors, magistrates, shipbuilders, money counters, and men who understand that disorder, left unobserved, becomes expensive very quickly. So when you arrive, the city does not greet the new disease with the same moral tremor you felt in Rome, or the same searching inward you sensed in Florence. Venice does something more Venetian. It organizes. The city rises from the lagoon, like a machine built to regulate contact. Ships approach under scrutiny. Goods are recorded. People are sorted by status, purpose, and usefulness. Water carries everything here. Grain, silk, gossip, spices, priests, ambassadors, infection, and because water carries everything, the city has spent generations learning how to inspect arrival before allowing it to become intimacy. That instinct now shapes its response to the new affliction. At the harbor, nothing looks theatrical. There are no banners proclaiming salvation, no singular gesture dramatic enough to satisfy history's later appetite for beginnings. Instead, there is process. Questions asked at disembarkation. Delays imposed. Cargo examined. Men in office not because they are saints or visionaries, but because someone must decide who enters, who waits, who is watched, and where suspicion should settle. Venice has long experience with plague, and that memory has left behind institutions. Health magistrate, quarantine practice, islands of separation, administrative habits that treat disease not merely as a spiritual challenge or a private shame, but as a problem of circulation. If danger travels through bodies, then the state will concern itself with bodies. If ships carry risk, then ships will be inspected. If certain spaces intensify contact, then those spaces will be monitored. The logic is cold, but not senseless. You see it most clearly in the Lazaretto, the isolation space set apart from the main body of the city. A place where the sick or suspect can be held at a measured distance from the living pulse of trade and family life. Venice did not invent fear, but it did become unusually skilled at giving fear an office, a ledger, a schedule, a boat route, and a legal authority. There is something almost soothing in the precision of it. A city that cannot banish uncertainty tries at least to map it. You stand one morning on a quay while a vessel newly arrived waits under difficult, not to admire the sober competence of the scene. No one here believes purity is natural. Purity, where it exists at all, must be negotiated. Time itself becomes a medical instrument. 40 days at anchor. Goods aired out. People observed. Symptoms watched for. Venice turns patience into policy. And yet even here, with all this structure, the new disease slips past the edges of control. Because unlike plague, which can at least be imagined in relation to ships, rats, neighborhoods, and visible bursts of mortality, this affliction moves with a more intimate subtlety. It travels along the hidden lines of pleasure, secrecy, transaction, and delayed consequence. It can cross a city without ever presenting itself at the gate, in a way a magistrate might properly record. That is why the story in Venice shifts toward the spaces of controlled intimacy. The courtesans are impossible to ignore. Not simply prostitutes in the roughest sense, but women occupying a more elaborate social role in Venetian life. Some educated, some artistically trained, some moving among wealthy clients, diplomats, and merchants with a cultivated poise that makes them part companion, part ornament, part economic actor, part mirror of the city's own refinement. Their apartments may hold books, instruments, imported fabrics, polished furniture, perfumes, and a level of conversation not always found in male company. In Venice, desire is often draped in silk before it is named, but refinement does not make the body invulnerable. And because the city understands where commerce and flesh intersect, regulation begins to gather around these women as well. Registrations, examinations, restrictions, quiet removals. A disease that had already carried shame elsewhere now becomes, in Venice, an object of bureaucratic concern. It is measured not only in suffering, but in civic management. You feel the emotional texture change here. Rome had given the disease moral language. Florence had given it observational attention. Venice gives it administration. And still, administration is not mastery. Some courtesans adapt by narrowing their circles, relying on known patrons instead of unknown traffic. Others shift toward performance, music, wit, and controlled company, placing more distance between suggestion and contact. Some disappear from the visible world altogether, whether to illness, exile, poverty, or private protection. No one says too clearly. Among poorer women, the city's concern is less elegant and more brutal. Examination means exposure. Suspicion means vulnerability. Regulation falls unevenly, as it always does. Beyond those circles, daily customs begin to adjust almost invisibly. Bathhouses lose some of their innocence. Shared cups acquire a new emotional weight. Gestures that once signaled warmth or trust begin to attract a second thought before they are offered. Kisses of greeting, embraces between acquaintances, the easy proximity of crowded interiors, all these remain, but not unchanged. Suspicion does not abolish ordinary contact. It merely teaches people to feel the contact more sharply. You notice it in churches too. The faithful still gather, of course. Venice would not cease praying because bodies had become uncertain. But the idea of shared vessels, shared breath, shared physical nearness no longer rests quite so lightly in the mind. Ritual remains, yet ritual now carries the shadow of calculation. The city does not become sterile. It becomes conscious. And consciousness is both a gain and a burden. Because once a society begins tracking pathways of risk, those pathways never quite disappear from view again. This is Venice's quiet revelation. Civilization may refine response, but it cannot dissolve vulnerability. In fact, the more organized a city becomes, the more clearly it sometimes sees its own limits. Here, order is elegant, procedures are mature, authorities are attentive, yet the disease continues moving beneath, beside, and through the visible architecture of control. That is the paradox you come to understand while watching gondolas pass beneath windows lit gold. At dusk, while clerks tally and tries by fading light, while servants sweep thresholds, while bells travel softly over water, the city is not failing. It is functioning beautifully. And precisely because it functions so beautifully, it reveals a harder truth. Order is not there. Same thing as victory. Venice cannot completely block the new disease. It cannot inspect every embrace, register every concealed symptom, isolate every body before the body itself understands what it carries. There is no decree sharp enough, no canal deep enough, no island far enough, no magistrate thorough enough to produce absolute safety inside a world built on movement. But the city learns something else instead. It learns how to live with danger, without surrendering the whole structure of life to it. Markets continue. Ships continue. Music continues. Government continues. Desire continues, though more cautiously and at greater cost. Venice does not cure uncertainty. It domesticates it. By evening, as the last light loosens itself over the lagoon and windows begin to glow one by one, the city seems almost serene again. Water receives the sky without argument. Oars dip and rise. Voices blur over distance. Somewhere behind carved shutters, merchants count, women undress, candles are lit, servants fold linens, and men who spent the day regulating the risk of disease finally sit down to supper as if administration itself could restore the world to order. Perhaps, for a few hours, it almost can. At least enough to make the city habitable. That may be Venice's true achievement, not conquest over illness, but the invention of habits strong enough to let life continue in its present. And then, gradually, the story turns north. The air thins. The roads lengthen. Stone gives way to mountain silence. And as the cold season gathers beyond the Alps, the rhythm of the journey slows, as though Europe itself were drawing a deeper, quieter breath. Crossing the Alps changes not only the landscape, but the tempo of thought. For days, the world narrows into paths, weather, animal breath, and the sound of your own movement through a colder and more demanding geography. The roads are less like roads than arguments made against stone. They bend where they must, vanish into passes, reappear beside precipices, dip into valleys, where water runs so clear it seems too pure for human use, then rise again through forests already touched by winter. Travel loses its urban clutter here. It becomes simpler, harder, slower. This slowing is a kind of mercy. After the layered intensity of Italy, the ports, the sermons, the studios, the regulations of Venice, the mountain passage quiets the story down. Snow lingers in the higher places. Wind finds every gap in cloth and leather. Mules lower their heads and keep walking. Inns, when you find them, feel less like public houses and more like temporary shelters carved out of necessity against a world that would otherwise remain indifferent. At night, the mountains erase argument. Inside a timber room above a stable, with boots drying near a fire and the smell of wet wool rising from cloaks hung on pegs, men speak more softly than they do in cities. Less performance, more fatigue. The disease is still talked about, but now it sounds different, not because it has become less frightening, but because distance and weather have stripped away some of the excitement. You hear fewer grand theories, more practical noticings. A man in one village says the pain seems worse once the light is gone. Another says some sufferers appear improved for weeks, and then worsen again. A traveler insists cold weather helps, though he cannot say whether it helps the illness itself or merely confines people enough to reduce fresh entanglements. These observations are small, But increasingly, small observations are what matter. By the time you descend into the German-speaking lands, winter has fully claimed the year. Augsburg receives you not with splendor in the Italian sense, but with order, solidity, and the confidence of a city built on trade, finance, and disciplined civic life. Its houses feel heavier, its streets broader in places, its rhythms more inward-facing now that cold presses people toward hearths, workshops, and rooms with shutters fastened early. The city is prosperous, and prosperity in winter has a particular sound, doors closing well, carts moving deliberately, boots on packed ground, hammers from workshops, church bells muffled by air so cold it seems to hold sound in place. Inside houses, life contracts around heat. Families gather closer to one another. Meals are simpler, denser, more repetitive. Candles matter. Fuel matters. Dry socks matter. Work continues because it must, but much of it now happens indoors. Weaving, bookkeeping, copying, carving, mending, brewing, preparing stock for spring. The body, in such a season, becomes less theatrical and more noticeable. A cough in a warm room sounds louder. A limp crossing a threshold carries more weight. Pain has fewer distractions available to it. It is in this winter quiet that you begin to notice another change in the way the disease is being understood. Not solved. Understood only a little. Augsburg's physicians do not possess miracle knowledge. They remain children of their time, educated in Galen, respectful of inherited structure, and fully capable of prescribing bloodletting, purging, warming, cooling, drying, moistening, mercury, regimen, and prayer in combinations more hopeful than precise. But the disease has persisted long enough now, and spread widely enough, that some men have begun to do something subtle yet historically important. They compare cases. They do not merely treat the patient before them as an instance of humoral imbalance. They ask, what appeared first? What came next? Did the sore heal before the rash? Did the fever follow or precede the skin eruption? How long was the interval? What happened after the mercury? Did the treatment relieve the patient, or only weaken him differently? This kind of attention does not look revolutionary from the outside. It looks like seriousness, like care, like a physician growing less willing to repeat formulas simply because the formula is old. And in a culture that has long grounded authority in revered texts, this shift toward accumulated observation feels almost immodest. Yet, it is happening. In a modest chamber lined with books and jars, you watch a city physician speak not in the grand language of final causes, but in the tentative language of sequence. He still cites Galen. Of course he does. To abandon Galen entirely would be to abandon the grammar in which medicine has long thought itself possible. But when the patient leaves and the room settles, the physician admits what the text cannot repair. The old authorities did not describe this illness clearly enough for easy comfort. The books remain honored, yet the body keeps presenting facts that are annoyingly alive. That annoyance becomes productive. The winter deepens. Snow gathers along rooflines, in courtyards, on church ledges, on the shoulders of statues and the upper curves of gatehouses. Windows frost at the edges. Breath turns visible. Streets empty earlier. The sick become more conspicuous because everyone else is trying so hard to remain indoors. If a man still goes out despite visible suffering, the suffering must be substantial. If he disappears, people notice the absence sooner. The season creates a new kind of visibility, and with it comes speculation about seasonality itself. A few practitioners begin to wonder whether the illness changes with the weather, not in origin, perhaps, but in expression. Do fewer fresh cases appear in the cold, because appetite itself is driven indoors and narrowed? Do symptoms feel sharper in winter because the body, already taxed by cold and scarcity, has less surplus with which to conceal distress? Or is the apparent lull merely an illusion produced by isolation? No one knows. But even such questions mark a shift. They are questions attached to patterns, not merely to doctrine. From Augsburg you continue toward Heidelberg, and the journey itself seems to lower the pulse of the narrative. The roads are quiet under a pale sky. Vineyards stand stripped and sleeping. River towns huddle against the season. Smoke rises almost straight upward in the stillest mornings. The farther north you go, the more Europe seems to fold in on itself, as though the winter has forced every household, every guildhall, every hospital, every lecture room into a more concentrated form of life. Heidelberg carries a different atmosphere from Augsburg, less mercantile, more scholarly, though not detached from the practical world that feeds scholarship. Here, university life introduces another layer to the disease story. Students, physicians, and learned men do what learned men always do when the world presents them with troubling novelty. They classify. In disputations and private conversations, the illness is increasingly described in phases. A first stage, a later eruption, a deeper decline. The terminology is not yet settled, but the instinct is there. Sequence matters. Distinction matters. The body does not merely fall ill. It proceeds through a pattern that can be noted, compared, and perhaps someday predicted. This is important not because it cures anyone, but because it chips away at the idea that the ancient authorities have already said everything worth saying. And here lies the deeper turning of this winter chapter. For centuries, a physician could still imagine that enough reading, enough commentary, enough faithful adherence to inherited categories might eventually reveal the right answer. But this disease has made such confidence harder to sustain. Men can still revere Hippocrates and Galen, many do, sincerely and intelligently, while admitting, in practice if not always in public, that the eye has begun to claim a new authority. When the old books fail to account fully for lived suffering starts to teach. That lesson does not arrive triumphantly. It arrives in notebooks, in case comparisons, in cautions muttered, after failed mercury courses, in the uncomfortable fact that a peasant's body may sometimes reveal more about the disease than a polished commentary does. And outside, beyond all lecture and treatment, winter continues its own instruction in quietness. The city after dusk is almost tender in its silence. Snow on roofs, lamplight behind shutters, a dog crossing a nearly empty lane, a woman beating dust from a rug in a courtyard because cold does not excuse all chores, a patient lying awake in an upper room while below him a family eats cabbage and bread and speaks in low voices, trying not to wake the sick, or perhaps trying not to hear him. There is sorrow in the season, but it is a softened sorrow. Snow has a way of reducing the theatricality of pain, not erasing it, never that, but lowering its volume. Even suffering seems to speak more quietly when the whole world outside the window has been covered in white. You feel that quiet settle over the story now. No one here has mastered the disease. No one has broken its logic. No one can say with confidence where it truly began or how long it will remain. But something has changed all the same. Observation now has a value of its own, not merely as a servant to tradition, but as a corrective to it. A physician who has watched enough cases through enough seasons begins to trust recurrence. A student who has seen the same sequence twice grows less satisfied with inherited vagueness. A barber surgeon who notices that one treatment worsens more often than it helps begins, however cautiously, to prefer the evidence of outcomes over the prestige of theory. These are not heroic shifts. They are winter shifts. Slow, inward, persistent, and perhaps because they are so quiet, they endure. Outside your window, snow settles against the ledge as though trying to hush the whole city into gentleness. Church bells sound farther away than they are. A cart passes only once in a long while. Somewhere in the building, someone coughs, then all is still again. The disease has not gone. It remains in rooms, in marriages, in memories of recent pain, in the fear attached to certain kinds of contact, in the caution now built into medical thought. But winter has altered the register. The panic of spread has given way, for a time, to colder habits of attention, and that attention will matter, because when the story moves on again, when it leaves these inward rooms and snow-muted streets, it will enter another setting entirely. Not the scholar's chamber, not the regulated harbor, but a more layered world of hospital wards, household burdens, and village endurance. In France, the disease will sink deeper into institutions, into families, and into the long daily labor of ordinary survival. Paris meets you first as density, not only of people, though there are people everywhere, students in dark gowns, clerks with ink on their cuffs, women carrying baskets through lanes, already slick with use, merchants with damp hems, priests threading between carts, apprentices shouting to be heard above one another. It is a density of smells too. Smoke, tallow, wet wool, horse dung, river damp, bread ovens, stale wine, human fatigue. And somewhere beneath all of it, when the wind turns or a door opens into the wrong corridor, the sweet sour heaviness of sickness. By the time you enter the city, the disease no longer belongs to rumor alone. It has settled into Paris the way difficult truths often settle into great cities, not dramatically, but thoroughly. It is in the university quarter, where medical men argue over names and causes with more confidence than agreement. It is in taverns, where students repeat what they half understand from lectures and what they fully understand from watching older men drink themselves brave enough not to worry. It is in churches, where moral explanations remain easier to preach than bodily ones. And it is in hospitals, where the flesh makes theory answer for itself. The Hôtel Dieu receives the poor the way a river receives rain constantly, without ever seeming fully prepared, yet never truly allowed to close its arms. When you first enter, the air changes at once. The outside world, noisy and disputatious, compresses into a dimmer order shaped by beds, bowls, linens, prayer, and endurance. There are long wards, crowded close. The sick breathe in layers. Voices remain low, though pain sometimes rises above discipline. Nuns and attendants move with the efficient gravity of people who long ago learned that pity alone cannot carry a body through a working day. A physician passes, followed by a younger man carrying notes and trying to look as though he belongs there. No one here speaks of the illness in abstract terms for long. In a hospital, all grand ideas must eventually pass by an actual bed. One man has sores hidden beneath wrappings and pride. Another, a laborer from the edge of the city, can no longer work through the bone-deep pain that wakes him at night. A woman sits upright because lying down has become its own discomfort. A youth who thought himself recovered weeks ago now bears the second phase of the disease and stares at his hands as though they belong to a stranger. The old medical language is still present, of course. Humors, imbalance, corruptions of blood and heat. Bloodletting is still ordered. Mercury is still used, sometimes as hope, sometimes as habit. Guaiacum still circulates as a costly promise, with ocean air still clinging to its reputation. But the wards teach a humbler lesson. Treatments are uneven. Bodies respond differently. The same physician may sound certain in the morning and troubled by evening. A therapy praised in one room is cursed in the next. And over all of it hangs that other division, just as powerful as the medical one. Who suffers in private and who suffers in public? The noble and the wealthy rarely arrive here. Their illness takes place behind doors, in chambers with curtains, with physicians discreet enough to preserve reputation and servants, trained not to repeat what they have seen while changing linens. If a gentleman declines, he does so quietly. If a lady is touched by scandal through a husband's infection or a hidden liaison, the household arranges explanation before the neighborhood can. Expensive decoctions are prepared. Imported remedies are obtained. Baths are drawn. Confessors visit privately. Even pain, among the privileged, is draped. But the poor cannot always afford secrecy. For them, the disease becomes visible in the very places where life is already most exposed. In hospitals, parish aid, crowded rooms, workshops, and streets where absence quickly becomes noticeable, because every hand mattered before illness removed it. A mason who stops climbing scaffolds, a laundress who can no longer lift with the same ease, a servant dismissed once lesions become too difficult for employers to ignore, a widow whose livelihood depended on the ordinary strength of her own body and now must be recalculated around pain. This is when the disease ceases to be only a subject of scholars and magistrates. It enters the economy of daily dependence. You hear that more clearly once you leave the hospital and follow the illness into homes. In one narrow street, a family eats in near silence because the father has been unable to work steadily for weeks. He tries to hold himself upright at the table, but each movement betrays effort. His wife cuts bread smaller than usual, so it lasts longer. Their daughter keeps watching his face. No one says the word for the disease, not because they do not know, but because naming it too plainly would give shape to several fears at once. Loss of income, loss of standing, loss of future. In another house, a servant girl whispers of her mistress's brother, who has gone to the country for his health, which everyone understands may mean almost anything except health. In a lodging room near the university, a student jokes about the French sickness, until the laughter fades because someone at the table remembers a cousin, or a master, or his own unexplained rash from last winter. Every social class tells the story differently. Every social class edits the shame in its own preferred style. And Paris, being Paris, turns all of it into argument. Physicians argue over causes, theologians over moral meaning, students over novelty, barber surgeons over practical treatments, street pamphlets over everyone. Roadsides begin to appear, sold cheap enough to travel widely. Some are moralizing, depicting reckless behavior, followed by visible punishment. Some offer remedies with more confidence than evidence. Some mock physicians, whose learning seems elaborate yet strangely powerless before the persistence of the disease. Woodcuts flatten suffering into instruction, satire, or warning. But their very existence proves something important. The illness has entered popular consciousness deeply enough to generate a market of explanation. Still, a city is not a country, and France becomes more interesting when the story leaves Paris. You travel north and west, toward Normandy, where war's memory still lingers in roads, walls, and the habits of people who have learned not to be surprised by disruption. The countryside opens into fields, hedges, market towns, and villages where life depends less on official medicine than on family labor, neighboring hands, and practical compromise. Here, the disease takes on a different emotional texture. It is no less painful, no less humiliating, but it is woven more directly into the long continuity of work. A farmer cannot afford to become an isolated case study. If he is ill, the harvest still arrives. Animals still need tending. Bread still needs baking. Children still grow. Weather still turns. In one village, you meet a man who can no longer do certain tasks because pain shoots through him in waves, especially after dark and in the morning cold. He speaks of it without drama, not because it is small, but because rural life has trained him to measure suffering by what work it interrupts. His wife has adjusted everything she can. The older boy now helps more with lifting. Neighbor comes over on heavy days. A local healer provides herbal compresses that do not cure, but do soothe. They do not discuss history. They discuss whether he will be well enough to mend a fence before rain. This is the point at which a pandemic truly becomes history, not when scholars first describe it, nor when rulers first notice it, but when it enters meals, marriages, greeting customs, household budgets, and the smallest rooms where ordinary people are already trying to survive. At a village wedding feast, you notice something subtle. Greetings are a little more measured than stories from previous decades would suggest. There is still warmth, still touch, still celebration, but also caution threaded through familiarity. Cups are more often kept to their owners. Parents make quieter inquiries about a prospective spouse's health and reputation. Jokes about soldiers and city pleasures carry sharper edges than before. No decree has transformed the countryside overnight. Rather, caution has seeped into custom one gesture at a time. Rouen shows you the same process at a larger scale. The city is prosperous again, rebuilding confidence through trade, craft, and river traffic. Yet the disease has left marks here too, not only on bodies, but on institutions. There are efforts now to separate, to classify, to assign certain sufferers to certain forms of care. Barber surgeons are expected to recognize cases more readily. Civic and religious authorities coordinate unevenly, sometimes compassionately, sometimes punitively. The point is not that Rouen has solved anything. It has merely accepted that the affliction must be managed as part of urban life. What moves you most in Rouen is not official policy, but the way the disease appears in art. In a church, light passes through stained glass newly rich with figures of affliction and endurance job. Saints associated with sores, suffering, trial, patience. Religious imagery has always known how to handle pain. But now one senses that people are looking for themselves in these windows, a little more directly. On the street, illustrated sheets and cheap prints circulate with moral warnings or practical advice. The elite commission art that folds bodily vulnerability into piety. Common buyers purchase prints that make the disease legible in cruder terms. Different classes, different aesthetics, same need. To place suffering into an image and say, "There, now we can bear to look at it." Even manners begin to shift. There is less carefree touching in taverns. Slight bows replace some embraces. Shared vessels disappear more often. Inns think harder about sleeping arrangements. Parents, priests, and employers all become slightly more watchful over youth, especially where appetite and opportunity might meet. No single custom vanishes completely. France is not remade in one season, but the texture of public life grows finer, more alert to contact. And underneath all this runs the most ordinary truth of all. Most people are not living with an epidemic as an idea. They are living with a husband who can no longer climb stairs without wincing. A daughter whose marriage prospects have dimmed because rumor traveled faster than pity. A craftsman whose hands tremble after treatment. A servant dismissed for visible symptoms. A long winter night made longer by bone pain. A family meal stretched thin because medicine cost more than expected. A church visit undertaken because prayer is free. And sometimes free things are all that remain. That is where the disease really lives now, in the daily arithmetic of loss and adaptation. France teaches you that clearly. It is not only in hospitals, not only in physicians' notes, not only in the frightened imagination of cities. It is in household timing, in labor redistributed, in silence at table, in altered gestures, in the way people begin to ask different questions before allowing someone close. And yet, for all that, life does not stop. Children still race through lanes. Bakers still rise too early. Students still boast. Priests still preach. Merchants still underpay. Women still laugh in doorways. The river still carries goods. The bells still ring. France continues, as all places do, not because suffering is small, but because continuation is one of the oldest human arts. By the time you turn your thoughts toward the coast and the crossing beyond, the pattern has become unmistakable. The disease changes accent from region to region, but not its deeper habits. Every place tells itself a local story about what is happening. Every place adapts with local materials. Every place divides suffering by class, respectability, and access to care. Every place mourns in ordinary rooms, more than in official accounts. And when you cross the sea toward England, you begin to realize that the pattern will repeat there, too familiar in structure, altered in tone, as though the same fear had learned to speak with a different voice. England presents itself first through weather, timber, and organization. You feel it in the approach to London before you fully understand it. The river carries traffic under a pale sky that rarely seems to settle on one mood for long. The air is damp, the light often filtered, the shoreline increasingly crowded with wharves, warehouses, cranes, and narrow boats moving with the practical impatience of a city that understands itself through trade. London does not look like Paris, and it does not move like Venice, but it possesses its own form of complexity, less ceremonially layered than Rome, less mercantile in display than certain Italian cities, yet deeply structured by institutions that distribute obligation across parish, guild, household, and crown. That structure matters because disease always reveals the frame of a society as much as the weakness of its flesh. You see it immediately in the way people speak of care. Not only doctors, not only hospitals, but parishes, guilds, almshouses, households, charitable foundations. The system is less centralized than some on the continent, more pieced together from older responsibilities and local habits. That makes it uneven. It also makes it resilient in its own way. London itself feels crowded without quite feeling theatrical. The port fumes with wet rope, ale, offloaded wool, smoke, fish, and mud. Purchases carry more than seems reasonable. Shop signs swing above streets too narrow for comfort. Church towers rise through mist. The bells are always somewhere, even when you cannot see the church that makes them. In inns, the benches are heavy, the rooms drafty, the talk full of politics, weather, shipping, and health. Health now belongs in that list everywhere. By the time you arrive, the disease has become sufficiently established that it no longer startles in the same way, yet it has not become ordinary either. It sits in the city like an unwelcome truth everyone has made room around without ever growing fond of. Men speak of it cautiously, women often more practically, clergy more morally, physicians more elaborately, barber surgeons more bluntly. Through learned circles, you hear the name of Dr. Lineker spoken with respect. He belongs to that class of men who represent English medicine at its most ambitious, educated, reform-minded, attentive both to older authorities and to the need for better observation. In him, as in several continental physicians you have already encountered, you sense the age trying to become more exact without yet possessing the tools for a full exact. He and those like him understand something crucial. Careful record matters. Cases are compared. Symptoms are noted. Outcomes are remembered. Patterns are sought. This does not make the disease less painful, but it does make the intellectual response less vague. London's more serious medical minds are beginning to gather what we might call evidence, even if they would not yet use that word as later centuries will. Maps of where cases appear, notes on progression, observations on which treatments seem merely dramatic and which offer some measured relief. It is slow work, humble work, but it accumulates. In hospitals, the disease takes on its familiar but newly English form. At St. Bartholomew's, charity and strain coexist. The institution is older than any current outbreak, shaped by medieval piety and urban necessity rather than by any single disease. Yet like all such institutions, it adapts. Beds fill, staff adjust. Sufferers whose cases do not fit neatly anywhere else are folded into the larger burden of urban illness. One ward smells of sweat, damp linen, and broth, another of herbs and metal. Here the poor come not because hospitals promise miracle cure, but because there is nowhere else to go once work fails, and private rooms are impossible. A former sailor tells his story in halting fashion. It began, he says, with something small enough to ignore while at sea. Then came pain, then weakness, then the inability to do the work on which his wage depended. On a ship, an ailing man quickly becomes a problem of labor. Once put ashore, he becomes a problem of survival. His body now carries not only disease, but economic displacement. A woman in service suffered differently. She married a man who had marched abroad and believed the worst of his troubles already behind him. When the illness later unfolded more fully, it entered not a barracks or a brothel, but a household. Her husband died first. She was left with symptoms, suspicion, and almost no legal or financial protection worth naming. In the hospital, she speaks not of the pox first, but of dismissal, blame, and the speed with which respectability vanishes once visible lesions appear. That is the English pattern too. The disease is never just medical. It travels through structure. Who belongs to a guild and may receive support? Who has a parish willing to assist? Who has kin nearby? Who can afford a physician? Who must make do with a barber surgeon and herbs bought at market? Who has a room of her own? Who shares a bed with children or apprentices or an aging parent? Who can leave the city? Who cannot? The farther you travel, the clearer it becomes that epidemic disease is always an X-ray of social arrangement. London's wealthy can retreat. They can pay for privacy, imported remedies, and the discretion of learned men. Merchants of the middling sort may afford some treatment and some behavioral changes. Better hygiene, altered sleeping arrangements, caution and companionship, avoidance of the more notorious stews and bathhouses. The poor continue closer to exposure, not because they are morally weaker, but because poverty allows fewer barriers between one body and another, fewer options once labor is interrupted, and fewer ways to turn suffering into secret. Barber surgeons fill the gap between learned medicine and common necessity. In shops that smell of soap, blood, singed cloth, and sharpened steel, they cut hair, pull teeth, lance abscesses, set fractures, bleed patients, and offer remedies for this new disease with a practicality physicians sometimes affect to disdain and quietly study all the same. Some use mercury sparingly. Others trust poultices and topical applications more than grand theory. They know, often by grim repetition, that a treatment can injure as efficiently as the disease itself. Their knowledge is not elegantly written, but it is thick with outcomes. When you leave London for the countryside, the story grows quieter again. The English rural world is greener than much of the continent, but its calm is no guarantee of safety. Villages do not escape simply because they are smaller. They receive the illness more slowly, perhaps, but once it arrives, it enters families rather than crowds. A wool merchant brings it back. A soldier returns from service. A young man visits town and carries home more than goods. A husband infects a wife. A child is born already marked by what the parents barely understand. That last part stays with you. In one household, the signs in an infant are subtle at first, then too persistent to ignore. The older generations call it weakness, poor luck, God's trial, inherited frailty, anything but the frightening implication that disease may cross not only through pleasure or contact, but through birth itself. The mother moves with exhausted tenderness. The father speaks little. The local healer does what can be done, which is not much. In such houses, the illness becomes almost too intimate for public language, and yet it still enters community life. Neighbors help at harvest when a man's limbs fail him. Priest counsels moderation and prayer in the same breath. The barber surgeon rides out from a market town with whatever remedies he trusts this month. Women trade practical advice by wells and ovens, sorting useful observation from pious nonsense as best they can. The church in England, still wholly within the old religious order of the age, frames the disease through sin and discipline when it speaks officially. But local priests, like local healers, often become more practical when faced with actual suffering. A sermon may condemn vice in the abstract. A parish visit to the sick becomes a different act altogether. Gentler, closer, less interested in rhetoric than in whether the afflicted have broth, firewood, bedding, and someone to sit with them after dark. This too is part of the structure. Charity is not only doctrinal, it is logistical. Back in London, guilds serve a similar role. Membership may mean a safety net, a little money, some support for a widow, a burial arranged, an apprentice transferred, a family not wholly abandoned when one wage earner falls away. Disease exposes hierarchy, yes, but it also reveals the webbing that keeps some people from falling as far as others. By now you have crossed enough borders to recognize the repetition. Different cities, different accents, different institutions, same underlying pattern. Where there is wealth, suffering is hidden. Where there is poverty, suffering becomes visible. Where institutions are strong, adaptation comes faster. Where bodies are observed carefully, knowledge inches forward. Where structure is thin, families improvise. Everywhere, ordinary life refuses to stop. The deeper you go into this history, the less the disease seems like a single event, and the more it seems like a force passing through pre-existing social architecture, lighting it from within. Suddenly you can see which beams are strong, which rotten, which rooms were always overcrowded, which doors were never open to everyone in the first place. That may be the larger lesson England gives you. The epidemic is never merely a matter of microbes, lesions, or pain. It is a matter of arrangement, of who is recorded and who is forgotten, who is carried and who is cast out, who receives theory and who receives trial, who can transform illness into convalescence, and who must endure it while still earning bread. And yet, even once you know this, the emotional register remains strangely gentle, because the English, like everyone else you have met on this journey, continue. They write things down, they compare, they adjust habits, they help where they can, they complain, they pray, they bury their dead, they make room in institutions not built for this exact burden, and call that adaptation sufficient because there is no other choice. A ship still leaves with the tide, a bell still sounds through fog, a family still gathers by the hearth while wind presses at the shutters, a physician sharpens his notes, a barber surgeon oils his tools, a mother watches a child sleep and wonders what can still be hoped for. The world does not become less itself because of disease. It becomes more revealing of what it was all along. And still, even after Italy, Germany, France, and now England, one question remains hanging over Europe with a persistence no treatment can quite quiet. Not how the disease feels, not how it spreads, not even how people endure it, but where, truly, it began. Lisbon and Seville open before you like two doors in the same wall. One faces outward toward the Atlantic, and beyond it the widening roots of empire. The other faces inward, as well as outward toward court, church, archive, and argument. Between them, the sea is not only water. It is explanation, suspicion, opportunity, and myth. By the time you arrive in Iberia, the question that has trailed the disease through every city now draws closer to its most magnetic form. Where did it begin? It is the sort of question people ask when suffering has outpaced certainty. Not only because they want facts, though facts matter. They ask because origins promise shape. If something began somewhere, then perhaps it belongs there. If it belongs there, perhaps one can place it at a distance. And if it can be placed at a distance, perhaps fear itself becomes easier to manage. That is what makes Iberia feel so charged. Here, more than elsewhere, sea routes and historical imagination have become tangled together. Lisbon meets you first through light. Amid brazen river damp of England, the city seems cut from brightness, white walls, hard angles, steep streets rising above the river, the whole place touched by the clarity of southern air. Yet what defines Lisbon is not merely what you see, but what arrives. The harbor is full of movement shaped by distances most Europeans still struggle to picture with any emotional accuracy. Ships from Africa, ships from India, ships from Atlantic islands, ships carrying spices, dyes, ivory, sugar, timber, skins, metal, stories, enslaved people, letters, officials, ambitions, and disappointments. A maritime empire has taught this city to think globally before much of Europe has learned how to imagine the globe. And with global reach comes a different medical atmosphere. In Lisbon, remedies do not come only from old Europe. They come from routes, from exchange, from colonial extraction and maritime experiment. Apothecaries here keep stock whose geography itself feels like an argument for a changing world. Powders, woods, resins, oils, roots, preparations whose authority rests not only on ancient text, but on voyage, rumor, observed effect, and the prestige of distance. You hear more than once of Guayacum. The wood itself has already acquired a reputation disproportionate to certainty. Brought from across the ocean, bitter, costly, wrapped in the romance of the New World, it enters European medicine half as substance and half as story. Boiled into decoctions, prescribed with elaborate regimens, praised in some circles as if the lands newly encountered across the Atlantic had yielded not only danger, but its cure. There is something emotionally satisfying in that symmetry, whether or not the body fully agrees. In physicians' rooms, the discussions are different from those in Paris or London. Not wholly different humors still linger, caution still exists, mercury remains grimly present, but the horizon is wider. A Portuguese doctor may speak in the same hour of Roman authorities, African botanical practices, and remedies known through trade with India. There is less confidence that the old Mediterranean world contains all useful answers, not because the past has been discarded, but because ships have made the idea of exclusivity harder to sustain. This widening, however, does not produce clarity so much as possibility. And possibility is not the same as proof. That distinction becomes more important the longer you stay. In the taverns near the harbor, sailors speak of disease, the way sailors speak of weather and coastlines, with details unevenly remembered, exaggerated by hardship, stripped of elegance, yet often carrying a core of observation scholars would do well not to ignore. Men returning from Atlantic ventures speak of strange ailments among crews, of sores and fevers, contacts made in places Europeans barely knew how to classify, of attempts to treat one condition with the plant knowledge of another continent. Some of what they say is certainly wrong, some of it is almost certainly embellished, but all of it feeds the larger Iberian atmosphere, in which the disease and the age of exploration seem impossible to separate cleanly, because exploration itself has become a kind of explanatory machine. When a continent suddenly realizes the world is larger than it thought, it also becomes more willing to believe that danger, cure, corruption, and renewal may all come from elsewhere. Distance becomes seductive. So does novelty. The Atlantic, in these years, feels less like a sea than an opening through which history has begun rushing too fast for inherited certainty to fully absorb it. That brings you inevitably to Columbus. By now his name no longer belongs only to navigators. It belongs to argument, to royal ambition, to disappointment, to wonder, to lawsuits, to maps, to memory already hardening into competing versions. The first voyage westward has become, in the minds of many, a hinge between worlds. And once the disease begins spreading explosively through Europe in the years after that voyage, people naturally begin laying one timeline over the other. He sailed, he returned, and then this. The simplicity of the sequence is irresistible. But simplicity, history teaches you again and again, is one of the most dangerous comforts. In Lisbon, you hear the theory discussed with confident shrugs and narrowed skepticism in equal measure. Some insist the timing says enough, that the men who crossed the ocean brought back more than parrots, gold hopes, and embellished tales. Others counter that Europe is old in disease as well as in sin, and that people forget how often afflictions remain half-seen until war, movement, and panic force them into view. A more thoughtful few admit that both things may be true in part, that some related disease existed already, that contact altered its spread, or that a new strain found new pathways through a newly accelerated world. It is not certainty that fascinates you here. It is how many intelligent people want certainty, and how ready they are to wrap that wanting inside a story. From Lisbon you move toward Seville, and the emotional temperature rises again. If Lisbon feels like empire in motion, Seville feels like empire being administered. The river carries traffic inward from the Atlantic world. The city itself seems to stand with one foot in Europe, and the other in a rapidly expanding overseas system, whose paperwork, cargoes, and dreams must all pass through human hands somewhere. Warehouses, counting houses, church towers, shipyards, officials' chambers, and private residences all participate in the same widening enterprise. Here too goods arrive with stories attached. So do men. And because so many of the earliest Atlantic voyages now belong to Spanish, rather than Portuguese prestige, Seville becomes one of the natural places where the theory of American origin gathers force. In learned rooms, doctors and clerics discuss the disease with one eye on the body and the other on chronology. In practical settings, former sailors and their families speak in blunter ways. Who came home when? Who fell sick first? Who kept silent? Who went to prostitutes after landing? Who began with a lesion and later worsened? The archives do not speak as cleanly as rumor does. That too is instructive. Where rumors love cause and effect, records tend to preserve confusion. A notation of illness here, complaint there, payments for care, delayed symptoms, vague descriptions. Bodies rarely produce evidence with future historians in mind. The paper trail of suffering is messy, partial, and full of absences. Yet those absences only sharpen the emotional appeal of the Columbus narrative. When documentation cannot settle the matter, imagination rushes in to finish the design. You spend time among physicians who are trying, more honestly than most, to hold uncertainty in place without pretending it has been resolved. Some describe the disease clinically, in stages, with greater confidence than their northern peers. Some advocate combinations of treatments, mercury in moderation, guaiacum, where obtainable, baths, diet, sweating, regimen. Some are deeply interested in whether Atlantic botanical knowledge might provide relief, where classical remedies have disappointed. But even among the best of them, origins remain elusive. One learned Spanish physician frames it with admirable restraint. The question, he suggests, is not simply whether Columbus brought back the disease in the crude sense popular imagination prefers. The question is whether transatlantic contact altered the biological and social conditions under which an already existing family of afflictions changed, intensified, spread, or became newly visible. It is a sophisticated thought for the time, and therefore less satisfying to ordinary listeners than a blunt accusation would be, because subtle truth rarely comforts as efficiently as a sharp story. You come to see that this is the real drama of Iberia. Not that it finally reveals the answer, but that it reveals the hunger for one. Europe wants the disease to have an origin tale. It wants a beginning clear enough to point at, retell, moralize, and assign. Columbus serves that need almost too perfectly. He is already a symbol of crossing, disruption, contact, and irreversible change. To attach the disease to his voyages is to fit bodily suffering into the same great narrative by which Europe is trying to understand the age itself. Discovery, expansion, exchange, consequence. And what if that narrative is incomplete? What if the disease existed in some form on both sides of the ocean? What if war in Italy, military mobility, sexual networks, urban density, and expanding trade all mattered more than any singular crossing? What if the origin was not one point but a convergence? Such possibilities are harder to preach, harder to print, harder to remember. Yet they linger. You feel them most strongly in conversations with men who have lived close to uncertainty, sailors, practitioners, older scholars, less eager to protect neat systems than younger men are to build them. They know, from weather alone, that cause is often layered. A storm is never only wind. A port is never only one nation. An illness is never only one event once enough bodies and roads and desires have become involved. And still, the story persists. Columbus sails west. Europe falls ill. Surely that means something. Yes, it means something. but perhaps not the simple thing people most wanted to meet. That is the most beautiful and haunting part of this final historical widening. The real fascination is not that a definitive answer waits at the end of the road. It is that an entire continent, confronted with new disease and new geography at once, tried to tell itself a story about beginnings in order to make fear more bearable. A story of importation, a story of contamination, a story of punishment arriving with discovery, a story in which the ocean became not only a route of commerce and empire, but a moral corridor through which hidden consequence entered Europe. The story soothes because it arranges chaos. When people do not yet understand a disease, they look for a narrative large enough to hold it. And in Iberia, with the Atlantic world cracking open old boundaries, narrative itself becomes one of the age's most powerful medicines, even when it does not cure. By evening in Seville, when the river darkens and bells drift across the city in long metallic waves, the whole question seems to soften again. Men are still counting cargo. Priests are still praying. Sailors are still lying. Physicians are still observing. Courtiers are still maneuvering. The disease remains, unresolved in origin, all too resolved in suffering. And after all the voyages, the documents, the arguments, the imported woods, the magnificent ships, and the widening maps, you are left with something larger than the question of where it began. You are left with the question of what it did to human beings. Now, at the end of the journey, the pattern becomes easier to see. Not because it has grown simple. It has not. But because repetition, when watched across enough places, begins to reveal its structure. Naples, Rome, Florence, Venice, the winter cities beyond the Alps, Paris, Rouen, London, the villages, Lisbon, Seville, all of them offer different light, different language, different arrangements of power and pity. And yet beneath their differences, certain motions returned again and again. First came fear, not always loud fear. Sometimes it arrived as whisper, hesitation, watchfulness, a new edge in familiar voices. But it came. It always comes. A body fails in a way people do not recognize, and suddenly every old certainty feels thinner than it did the day before. Then came blame. One people naming another, one city naming another, one class pretending the corruption belonged more naturally to someone lower, looser, farther away. The names changed with the border, but the instinct did not. The unknown asks to be given a face, and societies are rarely noble in the first face they choose. Then, adaptation. Not wisdom descending all at once, but adjustments. Quiet, practical, human, a changed greeting, a separate cup, an altered sleeping arrangement, a parish making room, a hospital dividing wards, a physician writing better notes, a wife learning how to redistribute labor when pain enters the household, a city creating offices to regulate risk, a village deciding who will help harvest when one family can no longer manage alone. That is how people survive history, not by conquering it in a single gesture, but by changing shape around it. The disease also revealed inequality with merciless clarity. In every place, the privileged suffered differently from the poor. Wealth bought privacy, discretion, imported remedies, private chambers, plausible explanations. Poverty made pain visible. It pushed bodies into wards, into public treatment, into dismissals, into streets, into communal dependence. The illness crossed classes, yes, but the experience of falling ill never did. And yet, even there, something more tender persisted. Help, dadulnush. Not enough help to redeem the century. Not enough help to erase cruelty, but help nonetheless. Neighbors lifting work that another body could no longer do. Religious orders tending the abandoned. Barber surgeons trying what they knew. Families shrinking meals and stretching coin and keeping vigil. Cities, however imperfectly, building procedures not because they understood everything, but because they understood enough to know suffering needed structure. At the same time, Medicine changed. Slowly, painfully, without triumph. The old authorities did not vanish, and the new science did not appear fully formed from anyone's frustration. But this disease, because it did not fit neatly into inherited categories, forced people to look harder, to compare, to notice sequence, to distrust treatments that harmed too reliably, to grant observation a little more dignity than tradition alone had previously allowed. So even in helplessness, knowledge grew, not cleanly, not quickly, but truly. That may be one of history's saddest gifts. Suffering often drives precision where comfort had tolerated vagueness, and the disease itself did not leave with the century. It remained. It would move onward through generations, through courts and barracks and villages and marriage beds and hospitals, changing in character, changing in treatment, changing in the meaning societies wrapped around it. It would long outlast the people who first tried to name it, blame it, pray over it, and regulate it. For centuries, it would continue its patient work inside Europe and beyond, threading itself through law, morality, medicine, intimacy, and fear. But this story was never only about the disease. It was about what the disease pulled into view. Human fragility, yes. The body is more permeable than pride prefers to remember. Civilizations, however brilliant, are built of vulnerable flesh. A chapel, a court, a harbor, a university, none of these protect a person completely from pain that enters quietly and changes the terms of ordinary life. And yet, the story was also about human invention. Not invention in the grand heroic sense alone, though there was some of that. More in the quieter sense. The invention of routines, of institutions, of forms of care, of language adequate to uncertainty, of social habits that allowed life to go on without pretending danger had disappeared. Every epidemic does this. It reveals how fragile people are, and it pressures them into developing new ways to live. That pressure can produce cruelty, but it can also produce insight. It can harden stigma, but it can also sharpen observation. It can expose inequality, but it can also reveal webs of care that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Under enough strain, societies become more visibly themselves, and now the night has grown deep enough that the journey itself begins to soften at the edges. Cities that once seemed far apart start to feel connected by mood, rather than geography. The harbor in Naples echoes faintly against the river in London. The hush of snow outside a German window answers the hush of a Venetian canal at dusk. The hospital ward in Paris lingers beside a village table in Normandy. A physician's notes in Florence drift toward a sailor's story in Seville. Everything has entered the same long chamber of memory. What remains there is not merely the disease. It is the way people move through it. The way they feared too quickly and understood too slowly. The way they blamed, then adjusted. The way they suffered unevenly. The way they cared imperfectly. The way they kept cooking, praying, bargaining, sailing, recording, tending, and enduring even as certainty failed them. That is the deeper history. Not simply what entered the body, but what the body's suffering revealed about the world around it. Outside, in whatever century you finally belong to, water still meets stone somewhere in the dark. Wind still moves over roofs. Somewhere, a person is keeping watch beside another person's bed. Somewhere an institution is straining to hold what it was not built to hold. Somewhere fear is still searching for a story large enough to quiet it. And somewhere too, quietly, people are adapting again, because that is what human beings do. They remain breakable. They remain inventive. They remain capable of both cruelty and care. And under the long pressure of history, they continue trying to make livable worlds inside conditions they did not choose. So when you think back on this age on its ships, sermons, workshops, wardrooms, winter streets, river ports, arguments over origins, and bodies marked by a disease no one yet understood, you may find that the final impression is gentler than you expected. Not hopeful in any easy sense, but steady. A recognition that history is rarely a clean sequence of disasters and solutions. More often, it is a slow accumulation of responses, some fearful, some wise, some selfish, some generous, through which people learn, imperfectly, how to go on. And now, with the journey behind you, and the cities dimming one by one into distance, that is what remains. Not a final answer, not a neatly closed moral, only the long image of humanity passing through affliction, carrying with it all the old flaws and all the old capacities for care. Outside, the water still laps its stone, the wind still passes over old roofs, and history, like every long night, slowly closes its eyes.